John Keane was born in South Australia and educated at the Universities of Adelaide, Toronto and Cambridge. He's a professor of politics at the University of Sydney and at some other unpronounceable German place in Berlin. In 1989, he founded the Centre for the Study of Democracy in London. He's a director and founder of the Sydney Democracy Initiative and in recent years has held the Karl Deutsch Professorship in Berlin, co-directed a large-scale European Commission-funded project on the future of civil society and citizenship, and served as a fellow of the London-based think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research. His research interests include China and the future of global institutions, the 21st century enemies of democracy, fear and violence, public life, power and freedom of communication in the digital age, religion and the history of secularism, philosophies of language, and what a wide collection. The origins and future of representative democracy, of government, and the history and politics of Islam, and has published in many of these areas. A few recently published works include Global Civil Society, Violence and Democracy, and the Future of Representative Democracy.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I can barely see you. A warm welcome to the card-carrying members of the middle class, surviving middle class here. I want in my time to, this evening, to get you thinking, to unsettle you perhaps, also along the way to challenge the well-known sarcastic remark of the Irish writer and playwright Oscar Wilde that the trouble with the middle class and its intellectuals is that we suffer a certain lack of imaginative thought, as he put it, a certain low passion for respectability. There are a lot of things that I want to say, the clock's ticking, so I have a half a dozen key points to share with you to get you thinking about this topic of the middle classes and the future of democracy. The first point has to do with exactly what is the middle class. You may know that the term itself has a history. It dates only from the 1740s, and it has changed through time, and it's a controversial category. It's not straightforward, and we should have a discussion about that tonight. During the 19th century, for example, it was used as a synonym for capitalists, those people who had enough capital that they could rival the nobility and screw the proletariat. That was Marx's view. In the century before, the middle class was defined as that bit of the population wedged between the nobility and the peasantry. Into the 20th century, for the first time, a Registrar General's report in the United Kingdom defined the middle class as that place between the working class and the upper class. And meanwhile, you probably know the middle class has been called everything under the sun. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, described the middle class as the standard bearers of the Protestant ethic, the Protestant work ethic. There are those who are less generous. Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, in Saint-Genet, where the middle class is defined as that nervous group that preaches against criminality, that sides with heterosexuality and generally has a fear of deviating from norms. Sometimes the middle classes are praised as standard bearers of reason. That was the view, for example, of Friedrich von Hayek, the Austrian economist. And sometimes the middle class has been seen as dreamers. One of my favorites is E.M. Forster, the writer, who said that one of the definitions of the middle class is that they're those people who abide by the rule, in come the dividends and up go the lofty thoughts. So here we are. Today's statisticians, as you heard from Bernard Salt, are less inclined to épater les bourgeois, to use Flaubert's term. There is a considerable debate about how to define statistically the middle class. Is it those people who live somewhere between the 20th or the 30th and the 80th percentile of consumption distribution? The World Bank defines the middle class as those people with incomes falling between the mean level in Italy and Brazil, 4,000 to 17,000 US dollars. An OECD report widely circulated defines the middle class as those people with daily expenditures somewhere between US $10 and $100 per person, and so on. The point is here, the first point is that there's a arbitrariness about these definitions. And what's also important to realize is that, of course, none of these make reference to the self-consciousness of people categorized as middle class. In the end, all statistics aside, feeling or being seen as middle class and believing in tomorrow, one of the basic characteristics of a middle class, may well be the most important determinant of how so-called middle class people behave politically. I shall come back to this, but for the moment I want to turn to a second point, and that is to do with the evidence of the decline or expansion of the middle class. This topic certainly needs to be handled with care. Frank Fukuyama has described the American situation, but there is emerging evidence that this is a much more widespread phenomenon in the Atlantic region. So, for example, the Bertelsmann Foundation in Germany quite recently has pinpointed the shrinkage of the middle class within relatively wealthy the German economy, around a shrinkage from around 65% 15 years ago to 58% of the population. There are countries, for example, in the Balkans, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Serbia, where the middle class has actually shrunk to somewhere between 4 and 10% of the population and are often referred to as the invisible class, largely kept alive by foreign investment. The area, I think, geographically, where stern warnings about the disappearance of the middle class and its potentially anti-democratic effects hail especially from Canada and the United States. You may know that even a museum in memory of the middle class has now actually opened in Schaumburg, Illinois, funded by the Ford Foundation, where if you visit the museum, you can look at these quaint customs from yesteryear, such as free weekends, remember them, day trips, eating at chain family restaurants, and watching television and baseball together. A Canadian report emphasizes this kind of trend. Until recently, it runs, and I'm quoting, the middle class was in a position that could be reached without grasping, often without a university degree, and enjoyed without too much worry. It meant a stable job, a house with a yard, a two-car garage, and perhaps a nice pension. But it's getting to the point, concludes the report, where having all of that could make you the envy of your neighborhood. So we see a trend, especially in North America, towards the loss of confidence in the future, the sense that saving for a rainy day belongs to a previous age, that disposable income is being reduced, that retirement plans are often in disarray, that there are disappearing pension schemes, and so on. And only a minority, it turns out, in this region believes any longer that their children will live as well as them. Now, Frank Fukuyama has talked about this evening, and he's written, I think it's among the very best writing we have about this trend and its political implications. I think Frank Fukuyama might be described as something like a class-conscious defender of the middle classes, of the liberal middle classes. And he calls for new politics that stand somewhere between David Cameron's concern for the strivers, Ed Miliband's talk of the squeezed middle, and Obama's talk of the need for a new economy where there's not a trickle-down effect or belief in a trickle-down effect of wealth, but actually where an economy grows from the middle outwards. Now, we've already covered this territory. I want to add actually a darker note to this, because it seems to me that the situation facing these middle classes in the Atlantic region in our times and for the coming years is rather grimmer. And it's rather grimmer for a couple of reasons. To do with, first of all, the improbability of a return to what Colin Crouch, the British sociologist, once called privatized Keynesianism. I mean, cheap credit that fueled a property boom that gave the sense to many middle-class people that they were becoming wealthier as the days and months and years passed. With the collapse of that, near collapse of that banking and credit sector, the bursting of the bubble, it's unlikely that we will see a return to that period. Or perhaps it will, in which case the observation of Charles Kindleberger, a German-American historian, becomes important. Market economies, according to Kindleberger, in a famous study, are prone to produce bubbles. there have been 11 major disruptive bubbles since the Dutch tulip craze in the 1640s, and 7 of these have occurred since 1970. And the probability of other bubbles developing in future must surely be high. There is also the point that if you look at the evidence, Frank Fukuyama just raised this, that there is some evidence available that the impact, the job-displacing impact of IT is beginning to have as well reduced productivity gains. That is, the advantage technologically of investing in information and communication systems, and the employment potential of that is actually in decline. Third point, this is all bad news for the middle classes, but there is an optimistic note in that, we've heard the phrase already, there is a growth of a global middle class taking place. What is important to emphasize that this is principally happening, overwhelmingly happening in our region, in the Asia and Pacific region. This is arguably the fastest ever recorded case of embourgeoisement under modern conditions. Its patterns of growth, the growth of this Asia-Pacific middle class, doesn't fit any standard categories. It defies nation-state boundaries. It defies north-south divides, talk of the West or the Third World. So that middle classes in cities like Bangkok and Guangzhou and Jakarta and Seoul are interconnected. The numbers are massive. The OECD report, which I've mentioned already, points out that we're likely to see, on all the evidence that we have, an increase of this middle class, global middle class, from 1.8 billion people to 3.2 billion by 2020, and maybe to 4.9 billion by 2030. And almost 85% of this projected growth is happening in our region. Now, behind these predictions, of course, usually stands the presumed giant of China, where a very large middle class is crystallizing. The size of this Zhongchanjieji, the middle class, is disputed. Some say it's around 12% of the population. Others project that it's growing to something like 30%. One of the great questions in matters of democracy in the middle class is whether this middle class, heavily dependent on the state, will actually choose to conform to that one-party state, to what Min Shin-pei calls a decentralized predatory state, or whether the middle classes of China will grow restless. It's a topic that Ben will take up, and I will pass to a fourth point. The key point now is, how reliable are the middle classes? Are they always an ally of democracy? Well, there is a view that goes back into the 18th century that makes us think twice. This, by the way, is a liberal view by Gilray of a Democrat in the early 1790s. It's not a very pretty picture. Liberals were not Democrats at this point, and with great difficulty came to speak the language of democracy during the 19th and early 20th centuries. You can see that transformation in the Liberal Party in Britain. The view that the middle classes have a natural affinity with democracy goes back to Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. If you look carefully at Aristotle, actually he doesn't talk about democracy, he talks about a political community, a certain type of political system, which he does indeed say needs a middle class. Usually the view is put that there is somehow an affinity between the middle class and education. Caught in the middle classes like education. They're in favor of reason, they're in favor of public life, they're in favor of respect for truth, for freedom of association. But in fact, the historical record teaches us to be more circumspect. I'm thinking here of a work, it's a famous work in the literature by Barrington Moore, an American historian, who must have written one of the pithiest, shortest sentences in my field: no bourgeois, no democracy. That's often misread to draw the conclusion that a bourgeoisie, a middle class, usually gives rise to some form of, say, parliamentary democracy. If you read Barrington Moore, he points out that actually under modern conditions, in fact, the bourgeoisie went in a number of directions. In one scenario, for example, in China and Russia, the middle classes were more or less annihilated. In another pathway, in Weimar Germany, for example, but also in Japan, the middle classes opted for totalitarian power. It was their outmaneuvering and their conviction that they should depend on the state that led them to reject democracy. It was only, for example, in the case of Britain or France, that the middle classes eventually went for parliamentary democracy. We'd want, I think, to complicate this picture even further, but what I'm suggesting to you is the political promiscuity of the middle classes. There is no law, let's say, of middle-class democracy. It depends on the circumstances, it depends on the power conditions, and it depends, of course, on decisions taken by middle-class people themselves. This promiscuity certainly applies to our region. If you read the novel by Tash Orr, born in Taiwan, grew up in Malaysia, now living in Britain, five-star billionaire, you will see a picture of struggling middle classes in the 21st century who feel lassitude, who feel fatigue, who suffer political headaches, who generally are irritable, who feel that nothing stands still, that life is just constant elbowing, and it's as if there is some kind of bedeviling of their lives by spirits, by strange spirits. And it's possible, it's just possible, that this kind of condition will lead to a rejection of forms of democracy. I want to introduce to you a big idea. This is a Big Ideas Forum. I suggest that we're living through a very major historical transformation away from parliamentary liberal representative democracy in the form that my grandparents and great-grandparents recognized, towards this, where elections are the centerpiece, parliaments are the centerpiece within territorial states of democracy, towards something like this, what I call monitory democracy, a much more complicated form of democracy, which in a few words is a new form historically of democracy in which free and fair elections remain important, nothing less, but where democracy comes to mean the checking and balancing and public scrutinizing and chastening of power from a whole variety of new institutions that never existed before in the history of democracy. There is, I think, evidence, this is my fifth and soon to be sixth and final point, that the middle classes show some interest in these new forms of democracy, that they have played, in fact, an important role in the building of this new monitory form of democracy. There are some symptoms of this. The fact that the middle classes are no longer party activists. In Australia, the Labour Party has remaining 8,000 activists. It was once a great political machine. Think of the ways in which, since 1945, the middle classes have actually contributed to the growth of new mechanisms that we now associate with democracy. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, peace camps, teach-ins, women's consciousness-raising groups, judicial activism, bioregional assemblies, freedom rides, non-violent coordinating committees of the kind that Martin Luther King was involved with. And more recently, in Japan, after Fukushima, middle-class people have set up radiation detection networks. In Sweden, I read quite recently, middle-class activists under the Occupy banner actually staged a bus safari through the very rich suburbs of Stockholm to teach the middle classes how the really rich live. And in Gezi Park, mentioned by Frank, what is interesting is the growth of all these new mechanisms, monetary mechanisms, balcony protests, the occupation of public squares, sing-ins, pots and pans demonstrations, earth iftar tables, where people break their fast collectively. There is evidence as well that the middle classes are contributing to new forms of governance in city arrangements. The C40 initiative is a case in point. I'm being very generously treated by the bell ringer, so I shall stop to introduce and to summarize in a few sentences my sixth and final point. Could it be, this is a thought for you, could it be that just as the middle classes, for example, in Britain and France and in the United States, plumped from the end of the 18th century through the 19th century till roughly World War II, for a form of representative parliamentary democracy within territorial states? Is it just possible that some parts of the middle class, even parts of that suburban middle class that Bernard Salt spoke about, the thinking people, as Hayek put it, is it just possible that these middle classes are the champions of a new historical form of democracy, a form of democracy in which arbitrary power is not tolerated because it's considered potentially to be the source of great injustice and evil? Thank you very much.